welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm your co-host, Fron Morgan, along with fellow co-host Kit Culver. Our goal each week is to take you on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption, restoration, and renewal. We hope that our warm conversational tone and format make an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some more approachable, accessible, and digestible, growing and edifying the body in the process. This is the 21st episode in our Journey Through the Scripture series. For those new to the podcast, our discussion format each week will be to respond to discussion questions embedded at the bottom of the study notes document. You can find this linked in the podcast description box. In the same box, you'll also find a link to our website, roadfromemmaus.com, where we share a bit about ourselves, how we got our name of our podcast, and provide several helpful resources to help you dig into redemptive history, no matter where you are in the journey. This includes the glossary, book recommendations, etc. Also, from time to time, Kit and I will respond to direct questions listeners pose to us that fit a current topic. We strongly encourage you to do that. We'd love to hear from you as well. You can reach us at contact@roadfromemmaus.com. Before we jump in, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube podcast and hit that bell for notifications so you always know when fresh content drops. We put out a new episode every Monday, and we look forward to you taking this exciting ride with us as we journey through the scriptures. Just to kind of bring you up to speed, if you haven't been with us the last several weeks, we've really dug in around the Sinai treatment, the covenant, to really have unpacked just how we got here, the provision of a mediator system last week. And this week, we really want to jump into just probably maybe one of the more publicized events in history, in contemporary knowledge around idolatry that is often misunderstood because it is not engaged from a redemptive historical perspective. And so as we jump in, we want you to keep in mind is that as we really explore and engage these topics, Kit and I are always coming from a very unique and particular redemptive historical standpoint. And as we mention certain phrases and themes, a lot of those themes, as I mentioned earlier, are referenced and unpacked a little bit more in our glossary, which is actually found on our website. So feel free to use those. And once again, we'll be talking through those things and hopefully unpack them to your satisfaction as we dig in today. As we jump in, our first question is, what was the Israelites' chief concern that prompted their action in response to Moses' extended absence on the mountain with the Lord?
Well, as we saw last time, just to kind of get us to this point in the storyline, after Moses and the representatives of Israel enjoyed that fellowship meal with the Lord on the mountain, where the text says they saw his face and they were not destroyed, and that they go down the mountain and Moses continues up for this 40-day encounter with God, during which God gives to Moses all of the prescription for the priesthood, for the sanctuary, for the tabernacle and all of its furnishings, and the way that whole priestly system of mediation is to come about. And during that time, the Israelites become more and more concerned. They know that Moses is up on the mountain, but as the text says, he's up there for 40 days. And that's a long time when you're sitting there waiting and thinking, is he coming back today? Is he coming back today? Where is he? What's going on? And what the text shows to us is that their concern was that if Moses doesn't come back, what happens to us? This is Exodus 32. I'll just read a few verses of it. It says, when the people saw that Moses had delayed to come down from the mountain, they assembled about Aaron and said to him, come, make us a god who will go before us. As for Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him. And so their concern is that Moses is the man that God set apart to come and to rescue us, to lead us out of Egypt. He's the one through whom God brought us through the Red Sea, and who has brought us now to the foot of this mountain out in the Sinai desert. He's the man who's stood between us and God in the receiving of the covenant. And now he's gone. And we don't know if he's coming back. So what's going to happen to us? How are we going to proceed on from him or from here? The man that God appointed to lead us, to direct us, to, in a sense, be the go-between between us and our God, the instrument by which God would bring us to Canaan. He's gone. What's going to happen to us now? So that's the setting in which the Israelites do this thing of making the golden calf. They're really concerned for continuing their journey. They know that God has brought them out of Egypt, brought them through the sea, brought them to Sinai, ratified this covenant relationship in order to bring them to the land that's at the center of the Abrahamic covenant, the God promised to the fathers, the land that is God's dwelling place where they're going to dwell with him. That's what their concern is how do we continue forward on this journey when the guy that's our leader is gone?
In the study notes, we argue that the construction of the golden calf represented a crisis of faith for certain for the Israelites, but not in the manner commonly assumed by many people. What needed perspective and evidence support this argument?
Well, really, if people will just read a little more carefully the account in Exodus 32, those first several verses, it's very clear. You know, we hear the golden calf and we think, oh, these people of Israel, they were forsaking their God. They were forsaking the God of Israel and saying, we're done with him. We're going to find a new God who we're going to serve and we're going to worship. But the text is very clear that what they're doing is trying to come up with a way to continue their relationship with God in the absence of Moses. So again, just reading a few more verses, they plead with Aaron to make them a god. And we say, okay, well, there it is. They want to pursue a different God. But when Moses, or I'm sorry, not Moses, Aaron, when Aaron takes the gold and the silver, the earrings, all of this jewelry from them, and then melts it down and makes this calf for them, he says, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." They're not trying to find a different God. They're not trying to, adopt an Egyptian God or a Moabite God or a Canaanite God or whatever. And in fact, Aaron goes on to say, um, he says, after he had seen this, after he had built this image, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation to the people and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to Yahweh,
Mm-hmm.
the God of Israel." And they rose up the next day and offered burnt offerings, brought peace offerings. They sat down to eat and to drink and rose up to play. Well, they're understanding that this image represents their covenant God. This is a way for them to worship, to honor, to stay connected with their covenant God. In other words, this image that they build, this golden calf, is taking Moses' place as the mediating entity between them and their God so that they can continue on with their God to Canaan. They're not abandoning God overtly. In their minds, they're simply solving the problem of we
Yep.
need a new interface between us and our God.
And Kit, I think to your point, ironically, they were more concerned about Moses forsaking them, or that was the conclusion that they were left with too, given his extended absence, that
Right.
he's not coming back down. What are we going to now do? And in their haste, in their concern there, to your point, let us go ahead and create something that will now stand as a substitute, to your point, another interface in that too. Kid, like with that reality, with that understanding, how does that help us maybe shape or maybe even have more sympathy for the people of Israel? Because so often I think people are like, yep, these people are wicked, this and that and stuff. Like, how does that help us properly frame what was happening a little bit better? Because I think at times people feel very judgmental during this
Right.
episode and definitely don't arrive at at like the conclusion that you've just presented.
Right. Well, again, it seems very strange that they've just committed themselves to the covenant. Moses has sprinkled them, they've said all that the Lord requires of us, we will do. They've enjoyed this triumphant, climactic fellowship meal together with their Lord. And now, how so quickly can they be starting to follow after other gods? Well, that's not what's happening. They're simply, in a certain sense, from their own perspective, they view themselves as remaining committed to their God and committed to the covenant, but they also recognize that God has established a mediating entity, in this case Moses, between them. When they were at Sinai, they said, Moses, you go, you hear the Lord, you come speak to us. You will be that intermediating presence. And so this structure of a mediator between them and God has been put in place. And now Moses is gone, and they don't know whether he's died or he's forsaken them. But as you're pushing into 40 days, it's like, well, wait a minute. I mean, that's a long time. A month and a half basically to be sitting there in the heat and what's going to happen to us? Where's this going to go? And with each passing day, it becomes more and more of a crisis in their own minds. So they decide that we have to come up with a new point of mediation. Well, why the golden calf? And I think that kind of gets us into our third question, but it's the way in which issues of divine human relationships were understood, the relationship of a worshiper with a deity or a god or a power in the ancient world, and the role that images played in that.
Indeed. And Kid, I think you just queued up the third question perfectly. In prior episodes, we have emphasized the importance of acknowledging and understanding. I think both parts are equally important. Our own and others' cultural rivers. I want to pause right there too, and I really want to encourage our listeners to go to our glossary. I'm actually going to read the definition that we put in there. I'm going to link this in the notes as well, so that as you guys engage, this will take you straight to our glossary, which is a phenomenal resource. When we say cultural river, we mean a phenomenon in which every person's perspective and often values are unequivocally informed and shaped by their unique community and cultural context comprised of many layers: personal, familial, generational, societal, geographical, political, religious, etc. too. So just want to make sure everyone has that context as we move forward too. With that being said, the question is, how does awareness and application here enable us to rightly understand the concept of magic, which is also going to be linked and taken to the glossary, from a biblical perspective, Kit? And then how does this help us see and understand why the Israelites believed that a physical image such as the calf actually brought them closer to God? To your point, Kit, in their minds, they were actually in communion and seeking to have a stronger, closer relationship, not more distance, but it actually accomplished the opposite purpose there, Kit. Can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, the cultural river thing, we have to, and this is true anytime that we're reading the Bible, as you've said so many times, reading someone else's mail. And it doesn't matter whether we're reading the Pentateuch or the prophet Isaiah or one of Paul's epistles. Paul is in a certain sense closer to our time in our culture, but still very distant. And Paul doesn't write his epistles to us. He writes them to other people. So in order to really understand what's going on, we have to dive into that cultural river, as it were, because whatever a scriptural text means, it means to the original audience. And we have to, in a sense, try to become that original audience, or at least understand that. And that's where this cultural river thing comes in. So with respect to this issue, in the ancient world, and in a broader sense, this is always true of human beings, this idea of how do I, as a human being, discover, reach out to, gain access to deities or powers or forces. And when I do that, how do I do that in such a way that they will take note of me and they will become amenable to me, they will become favorable to me, and they will ultimately give me what it is that I seek? That's something that all human beings, when they think about forces or powers or whatever, there's this sense of, okay, how do I gain access to them? How do I get them to notice me? How do I get them to become favorable to me? And in the ancient world, the way in which human beings would do that is through the use of different physical entities or objects. You see in ancient Egypt or Babylon or Assyria, the Sumerians, whatever, you see that they constructed images or idols, physical representations. And there was the sense that they didn't say, okay, this piece of stone is the god, whatever. But what they would say is that somehow that representation becomes the interface between me and that God. Somehow that God is present or can be accessed through that image. And so the image becomes the interface between the person and the God. And so what Israel was doing in building the golden calf, and you see this even in the text, this is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. They are, in a sense, trying to make God present, physically, tangibly accessible to them so that they can now interact with him in order that they will achieve the outcome that they seek. And that's this idea of magic. As you said, in our culture, wherever magic is sleight of hand, we think of magicians in Las Vegas or on TV or whatever. Well, and this term actually, in my use of it, our use of it comes from Gerhardus Voss. He uses this term to talk about how people practice this thing of religion. And so magic, in the sense in which we're speaking of it, is this inclination that's true of all human beings to take things that physically exist, things that I can touch and manipulate, whether rituals or potions or incantations or sacrificial things or objects or whatever it happens to be, things that I can tangibly take hold of and manipulate as a means of engaging with powers and forces out there, deities, whatever, in order again to make them amenable, favorable to me. And we can think about, again, Israel's, the sacrifices to Moloch or to Baal or to Ashtoreth, or even in our more recent times, the Mayas and the Incas and other cultures where their ritual practices are done specifically to get the gods to be favorable to them. That's religion as magic. And this is true of all human beings. It's true of all human beings. It's not just, oh, how could Israel fall into that trap? It was the very natural way for them to think about things, not only because the world around them operated that way, but this is the human way of operating. And we might say, well, I don't do that. I don't do this thing of religion as magic in that way. But we do. And even as Christians, we struggle with this because when we're driving down the road and we got somewhere that we need to be and we hear our tire blow out, we're like, oh, God, how could you do this to me? Right? I've been faithful. I do this, I do that. I've scratched your back. Why aren't you scratching mine? Or, when a beloved family member gets sick, we immediately are thinking, what can I do to get God to heal my child? Hey, pray for me. You pray, he prays, I pray, and we're trying to again use things accessible to us. I'm going to pray the rosary more, or I'm going to go to confession, or I'm going to read my Bible, or I'm going to give money to the church, or these things that I can do, these sacred acts or rituals that will cause the deity to give me the outcome that I seek. And this is all that Israel was doing. We do it in our own ways. And ultimately, this comes down to the very definition of idolatry, which we will deal with more, and the sense in which it's true that all human beings are inherently idolaters. And even as Christians, we still tend towards this thing of idolatry, turning this thing called life in God, in relationship with Christ, into just another religion and form of idolatry.
Indeed. And I think it's important to stamp kit that when we say idolatry, I know our mind immediately goes to artifacts or a totem pole. We're
Right.
talking about more in terms of how we think and operate in our minds,
Exactly.
too, to your point. Kid, as we kind of wrap up our episode, I'd love for you to unpack this next question. There is much controversy and confusion concerning Israel's violation of the second commandment, God's explicit prohibition against natural human religious conceptions and practices. What did Israel's actions reveal about their heart towards God from the perspective of covenant faithfulness rather than moral uprightness in obeying a directive, which is what I think we often, obviously, and we've talked about it the last several episodes, associate when we hear law, moral rightness, rectitude, standing, compliance. Maybe speak a little bit to that nuance and ultimately how we should be rightly understanding that, Kit.
Right. Well, I think our minds as believers, or if we're familiar with the scriptures at all, we look at the golden calf and our mind immediately goes to the second commandment, prohibiting the making of images. And we say, okay, there's where it is. Israel made a physical representation of a God who doesn't have a body. God has no form and you can't make a representation of him. And so the making, the physicalizing of God, if we can use that term, the making of the immaterial God into a physical form. Okay, that's the violation of the Decalogue, the second commandment. Well, it's really not that simple. The issue isn't simply representing God in physical form. If God can't be represented in physical form, we have a huge problem with the whole idea of incarnation, right? Because there we see the true, perfect, exhaustive, unblemished representation or embodiment of the living God in the human being, Jesus of Nazareth. And ultimately, I think we even talk in the notes to the fact that as Christ is the perfect image of God, he is that because in the first instance, man himself is the image of God. This takes us back to Genesis 1 and 2. So even in God's own design in creating human beings, he intended that he would be, in fact, physically manifest, physically embodied, physically known in the creature that is man. So God doesn't have an inherent problem with the idea of physical representations. But what's going on here is, again, Israel thinking that they can form God in a form and an image, an idea of their own making. They can, as it were, make him in their own image in order to manipulate him, in order to get him to do what they want. And this is that idea. John Calvin said the human mind is a perpetual idol factory. What we do instinctively, and even as Christians, we battle this, is we create God in our own image. My God is a God of fill in the blank. If God is good, then fill in the blank. How can evil exist and God be good, or whatever? But the goodness of God, the reality of God, the truth of God, the very substance of God, we define what that looks like based on our own criterion. And then we interact with that fabrication that we've put forth in order to get things to go the way we want. And then when it doesn't go the way we want, we're like, oh, God's not worth knowing, or he doesn't exist, or he's this, or he's that. This is what idolatry is all about, is that we start from our own minds, form our own conceptions based on our own agenda, so that our worship is just the promotion of our own agenda. And that's always been the case with human beings from the time of the fall. That's how we manage this distance between us and God. And that's what was happening with Israel. So it wasn't just simply, oh, here's a commandment. Don't create a physical representation. Oh, you did that. Okay, you broke the commandment. Okay, God's not happy about that. And if our listeners would go and read a parallel passage in Deuteronomy 4 where Moses comments on this, it becomes clear that the issue is once again falsifying what it is to worship the true and living God. It's not about a physical painting or a drawing, or, as I said, if God can't be represented in physical form, then we have to throw the whole notion of incarnation out the door, or even our own identity, as human beings, and our destiny, as Peter says, to be partakers in the divine nature. So the issue is that we don't have the right to, in a sense, take the relationship with God and take himself into our own grasp and make it be what we want it to be. And so even in the Decalogue commandment, God says, don't do this because I'm a jealous God. And that idea of jealousy is really like marital zeal. I am, it's the husband wife kind of thing, or the relational thing. I'm zealous for this to be the relationship that I intend. And you can't take that and redefine it and reshape it so that this becomes what you want it to be, and call that worship, or call that devotion, or call that faithfulness. It is, as we say here, about covenant faithfulness, which means authentic sonship. It's about being truly sons and daughters. That's what Israel was called to be, not just simply ticking a box on a list of 10 commandments.
Indeed. As we wrap up our episode for today, we strongly want to encourage you to actually come back for part 2 of this. We've actually just started. We're really going to dig into this. And then the following week, Kit and I, more than likely, are probably going to do our second rest drop. We feel like this is a critical juncture, not only in redemptive history, but just in terms of where Israel is with their relationship with God. And we really want to make sure that our listeners, are grounded and understand not only where we are, but actually what's coming and how all this ties together as a redemptive story. So we sincerely hope this time that you share with us has been profitable. Once again, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to the YouTube podcast. And we look forward to you joining us for our next episode. Once again, please send us questions, tensions, wonderings. We would love to engage with you in that format, in that way too. And we promise that we'll elevate those questions on our next episode so that you really feel like you're part of the process. For Kit, I'm Farhan, and we'll see you down the road.